Hello, I'm Casey Aiken, and this is 21 This Week. Coming up next, as Election Day looms, is the Hogan bandwagon picking up momentum. On the eve of peace summit with North Korea, how is President Trump doing? Remembering the assassination of Bobby Kennedy 50 years ago, and how did his politics change with his death? D-Day, 4 years ago, we have much to be thankful for. Our panel of insiders will give you the story behind the story. We're joined by business strategist and consultant Rich Parsons, Secretary of the Maryland Republican Central Committee, Mark Uncapher, Transportation and Railway consultant Phil Bell, and political strategist Susan Heltemes. Stay tuned for these stories and more on the next 21 This Week. While Maryland Governor Larry Hogan was being treated like a rock star at the Maryland Business for Responsive Government event, the 7 Democrats hoping to succeed him were once again trying to convince voters that they had the right stuff to take on the popular Hogan in November. Mark, Governor Hogan has been receiving some very good news lately in the polls, most recently a 71% approval rating. But let's be fair, his race is just beginning.
The race is beginning, and I think we've learned in the last couple of years that sometimes the conventional wisdom can be challenged. Just ask President Clinton. So I think the Hogan campaign will be running strong and be taking this race as though there's nothing to be taken for granted.
Oh my gosh, isn't that a politically correct answer? Rich,
now he'll laugh off camera.
Rich, Frank DiFilippo, writing in Maryland Matters, attacked the governor for killing the Baltimore Red Line. Is Governor Hogan going to be vulnerable on transportation issues?
You know, I don't think he is. I think that's actually one of his strong selling points. He's actually been pretty good on most of the transportation issues as far as the voters are concerned. His plan for widening 270 polls at 70% in favor, 10% against, among Democrats, Republicans, and independents. So he's not going to get attacked for taking a stand on transportation. And the red line thing, you know, he wasn't going to win any votes in Baltimore anyway, so I think he has very little cost politically for canceling that project in downtown Baltimore. I think he's vulnerable on some other things that he has very little control over, mainly the fact that he's a Republican in the state that Trump may have somewhat recovered a bit in his approval ratings nationally, but he hasn't in Maryland. He's extremely unpopular, and I think there's going to be enough of a blue wave here in Maryland. He's going to face some rough headwinds, no matter what.
That's what you're counting on, is a blue reaction.
It's there. You see it everywhere you go in Maryland right now, and I think that's going to be a real factor. He also hasn't stepped up on education funding. I think he's much more vulnerable there. There's some other things Democrats should go after him about. Transportation, I don't think, is one of them.
Susan, former head of the NAACP, Ben Jealous, appears to be picking up support, but isn't Mr. Jealous a little too liberal for most Maryland voters?
It would be presumptuous for me to say that he is or isn't. However, he was one of the main surrogates for Bernie Sanders in the presidential campaign, and Hillary Clinton easily carried Maryland, if that's a factor. And then the other thing that is most interesting, this week there were 8 states that had primaries, and I don't know the exact number because all of the seats haven't been determined, but an overwhelming majority of Bernie Sanders backed candidates lost, which I found extremely interesting across all of those 8 states. So I think our Democratic gubernatorial primary is going to be most interesting.
Absolutely. Rich, Phil Matalino, among others, have tried to link Governor Hogan to President Trump, and this is what Rich was alluding to just a minute ago. But is it a winning strategy, since Hogan has kept Trump at pretty far at arm's length?
You know, actually, I do think it's a winning strategy. It's a winning strategy for Larry Hogan, not so much Rich Matalino. Because the fact is, well, first of all, I'm going to have to disagree with Rich about the feelings of a blue wave in Maryland. I drive around it and tour around here, and I don't really see where it's coming from. Secondly, the economy's good. The state's improving. Larry Hogan's done a good job on his own. So why is there an overwhelming desire to go out and vote against Trump and say, gosh, I have to throw out Larry Hogan too, unless you're a liberal Democrat, someone who was voting against Larry Hogan 4 years ago anyway. So I can't see where that's going. I think if Rich Madaleno is trying to help him and his friends get into office. Trying to tie Larry Hogan to Trump is not something that's going to work for them.
So, but Mark, in the last time we were in this situation where we had a Republican incumbent, he was fairly popular, maybe not to the degree of Larry Hogan, but come the next general election, he was easily defeated. So are you worried about that?
Well, as I said, I don't take anything for granted. There were some big differences. In 2006, the Democratic Party was essentially completely unified around Martin O'Malley, and he came out with a strong head of steam. And as you say, the numbers were, although Ehrlich had a favorable rating, he was certainly not at the plus 50 level in terms of the reelect number that Hogan is at this point. So I think Hogan is in a strong
All right,
position.
so that's a wrap. I want to go to Rich and wrap this question up. Will whoever your Democratic nominee is, will the party rally around them?
Well, that depends. Mark is
It's
on
gotta
to
be
something.
quick.
It depends on the nominee. If it's someone like Rusher and Baker who can really have broad appeal across all sides of our party, it could be a real race. If it's somebody more fringe, Bernie Sanders wing only, like Ben Jealous, I think it's Hogan's race.
All right, thank you. Now, we're going to change subjects a great deal, and we're going to have a little fun for the rest of the show. 18 months into President Trump's administration, even Democrats who find the whole notion of a Trump administration odious should admit that he does have many accomplishments. But the never-Trumpers are vocal in their constant attacks on the Trump presidency. Rich, President Trump has not provoked a war with China. He's not pulled out of NATO, has enacted more stringent sanctions against Russia than his predecessor, and next week he's going to conduct peace negotiations with North Korea, things that people never thought were possible. So how is he doing?
Casey, if the test of being a good president is not getting us in a war with China, I think your standards are a bit low. This guy has been a disaster. I can't point to anything other than some ideological court nominees he's picked where you can actually point to success. He hasn't done anything with North Korea yet. I'm very skeptical he'll get anything out of that, even approaching as good as the Iran deal that he tore up in terms of their nuclear programs. He's good at tearing things up. The Affordable Care Act, for example, the Iran deal, our trade negotiations and relationships with all of our close allies. He's not so good at replacing them with all these better deals we keep hearing about. He keeps talking about better deals, and we keep getting shafted. The Iranians right now this week have announced they're restarting their research into next generation centrifuges, which the deal had at least put off for 10 years. Now it's happening now. How are we better off with Iran becoming a nuclear power sooner rather than later? Because he didn't have the wherewithal to get a better deal to replace what he tore up. He's a failure.
Rich complains, says he's a failure, but the stock market and business confidence remains high, and at record highs, as a matter of fact. The president passed tax reform. He's rolled back massive amounts of federal regulations, and he's done just what he promised to do when he was running for office. So even though a lot of Republicans, establishment Republicans, didn't like the president, are they becoming fonder of the president?
I think so, because I think there's a lot more comfort level with the policies that he's pursued. And I think there's almost a two-track going on, is that Donald Trump has created something of a lightning rod effect with what he does, and what he succeeds in doing is touch off what I think is kind of obvious Trump derangement syndrome on the part of the Democratic Party, which offers very little in the way of any substitute policies other than we're going to impeach Trump or we're going to replace him, and refuse to accept that there was an election and there was a change.
So, Phil, I'm not going to ask you the question I planned to, since you wanted to take on some of the things that Rich was saying about President Trump. I'll let you address those issues.
Well, I just have a hard time understanding where you're coming from with Trump as being a failure. Now, you talked about the Iran deal, and you said, well, he's destroying these deals, but he's not making anything better. First of all, it takes a while to negotiate. Even Barack Obama didn't get Obamacare passed immediately upon walking in and saying, bam, here it is. So you're also taking Trump to task because Iran is restarting, how did you put it, research into enrichment of uranium, something to that effect?
They're
restarting
next generation
How do you-
centrifuges,
how
which
do
they
you
had
even
stopped
know
and actually destroyed
how did
with
you know they
international supervision.
Did not stop doing that in the first place. That
Because
has
we
been,
had past tense inspectors making sure that they were complying with the deal, which everyone agrees they were.
An MO of every single one of these countries and every single one of these deals, as long as they've been struck, is the U.S. says, we're going to stop it. The country says, sure, we're stopping it. And next thing you know, it comes right back.
They
Well,
poured
and
concrete into 20,000 centrifuges that they had up and running that were permanently destroyed and disabled, and that is known and verified fact. Now
actually,
they have
it's not known
nothing.
and
It
verified
is
fact,
known and
number one.
verified.
All you need is
Wait,
20,000.
you haven't done your
I
homework.
want to go to Susan on this and see what, Susan, I know you're as unhappy as Rich is with the Trump presidency, but he has said that he's willing to accept a deal on DACA, but it seems to me that Congress is the one that's failing to act. In fact, there's a move by some renegade Republicans to try to force a vote on immigration this summer.
I know, and they're working. It's the first bipartisan thing that come along, but it breaks the Boehner rule, which means you have to have enough Republicans on it to pass it. That isn't happening. So Ryan is saying we can't deal with it. It can't pass.
Susan,
but let me finish. So what it is about him that I am most concerned about is that he has alienated our allies to the point that they are willing to drop us out of the G7 and move forward with the G6. When you have Canada, Mexico, Germany, Great Britain, all of them mad at us, it proves he's an idiot. But more importantly, the thing that he seems to think he's going to do is he has 3,000 names that was announced today on a pardons list, and he's not going through the Justice Department. He's doing it at a whim. In fact, he reached out to the Muhammad.
What does
Wait
the
a minute.
Constitution say?
No,
What does the
let me-
Constitution say about that, Susan?
There is precedent, but he said now today that, or it came out that he wants to pardon Muhammad Ali, and the panel, his family said, "Please don't. It was all resolved. We don't want you interfering."
it was
Casey,
thrown out.
Okay, I want to jump in on DACA for a second because something that Susan said I think needs to be corrected for the record. You know, there is an effort to have a bipartisan deal on DACA, which President Trump promised to support. He promised to
Of course
fix
he
the
did.
situation on DACA. It is specifically a veto threat from President Trump to that bipartisan deal that's preventing it from moving with Mitch McConnell in the Senate. It's ready to go in the House.
Rich,
It is Trump
pardon?
himself who promised us he was going to push for a DACA fix, who lied about it, and is now blocking
Now, Rich, you
efforts
can't
on the
go
Hill
there.
to fix it.
You can't go there.
He
Part
can't
of the
fi- he
deal-
can't
He's on the
fix-
part
record.
of a deal is
He's
having
on the
both
Rich,
record.
he can't
sides.
fix it himself.
on the
He needs
record.
Congress.
His
I want to
veto
go to
threat
Mark
is
to wrap this
specifically
up.
killing this
Well, if
effort.
it's not
Wait a
good-
minute, guys.
And
We
still
have
wants
30.
to stick with
DACA
We have
fix.
30 seconds.
Sure. A
Finish it
DACA
up.
fix has got to include strong enforcement provisions, and those come
We
in a
haven't even
variety
seen a
in a
bill.
variety come in a variety of
You mean like
forms.
a wall?
That
Like a
includes a
wall.
wall.
Yes,
It
a wall.
includes stronger enforcement efforts. That's
Democrats are
It's
ready to make
something
that
like
deal
76%
today. They were
of
ready to make that deal a
Americans
year
support
ago.
DACA.
No, they don't.
Yes,
how.
they
So
do.
you're willing.
you're-
Well,
Yes,
let's
they
be
do.
clear. So the Democrats are prepared to build a wall in
They
exchange
are prepared
for
for
DACA.
border security that's more effective than a
See,
wall.
that's
see,
You're
that's
never going to get a
different.
wall.
We're
You're
not
never
gonna
going to get a
okay,
wall.
well,
Nobody
maybe
wants.
you're never gonna get
You
DACA.
guys,
Have you ever seen-
Americans
See,
are
this is
against
You don't know what you're talking about.
This,
You're
this,
never
Nobody
gonna-
wants.
this
Why
is
do
what
you have a problem with
this
the
is what I love
You're
about.
never going to get a wall, and
You know, this is
Mexico's
what I
never
love
going
about
to
our-
get a wall.
Asinine
Okay, well,
to think
maybe you're
there's
never
ever
gonna
been
get DACA.
Ladies and gentlemen, this is what I love about our panel. All I have to do is say the word Trump, and we all
break
go
into-
in unhinged. Now, when we come back from this short break, we're going to remember the legacy of Bobby Kennedy, who 50 years ago was assassinated. Thank you. Stay tuned. And welcome back. We haven't stopped fighting since the cameras went dark, and now they're back on. So 50 years ago, Senator Robert Kennedy, immediately after declaring victory in the presidential primary in California, was tragically assassinated by a lone Palestinian gunman. Many believe that Kennedy was an activist champion that is the model for today's Democratic Party. Rich, history doesn't always tell a neat story, and has romance of a martyr's death overshadowed the fact that Senator Kennedy was well behind in the race. He may not have won the nomination over Hubert Humphrey or Gene McCarthy.
Well, I think, Casey, we don't know enough because not enough primaries had happened at that point. But in my experience, campaigns are won by message. And Bobby Kennedy had a message that was compelling and powerful and inspiring to an awful lot of people across a wide spectrum of the Democratic Party at that time. I think it's quite possible he could have won. We'll never know. I don't think enough of the primaries had happened yet to really make that call for sure.
But I just want to point out that Gene McCarthy was the original messenger, because Gene McCarthy is the one who defeated President Johnson in New Hampshire and forced Johnson out of the race. So Bobby Kennedy may have had a message, but he was riding someone else's coattails.
But he was more articulate.
Susan, many say that, I don't believe.
I think we'll never
you.
know.
Gene McCarthy was a very intelligent leading
Remember, I'm from
senator,
Minnesota.
and from your home state. So I'm surprised you're trashing him and throwing
I'm not trashing
shade
him.
his way.
I'm just telling the truth.
Susan, Kennedy appealed to people, seemed to appeal to better nature, as we were talking about the message that Rich was talking about, and a message of reconciliation. Is that lacking today?
Yes. And what's interesting in the lead up to the anniversary this week, and people talking, I found it inspiring that young people, again, teenagers, are being turned on to his message and talking about what he said. In fact, at the celebration at Arlington this summer, a young woman from Parkland read some of his speeches. Young people were inspired, and no one was really that articulate until Barack Obama came along. And the message, they had such an eloquence in their style that they just turned people in. And I lived out in rural Minnesota, and when I heard the morning that he died, I went to my mother and I was crying hysterically. And he had touched me, and yes, I'm a Minnesotan. I love Hubert Humphrey and Walter Mondale, but there was something about Bobby Kennedy that appealed to young people.
Mark, in 1968, the nation was at war with itself. What's changed since then?
I think we're kind of glossing over exactly how much at war we were in 1968, and just how fractured American politics were at that particular time. I think had he won the Democratic Party, had he continued to live, frankly, the Democratic Party would have been even more fractured than it was in any event in 1968. And at the end of the day, Richard Nixon would have been elected president in any event.
Phil, I saved you for last because you are the youngest on the panel. What impact, if any, did Robert Kennedy's death have on your view of politics?
You know, it's an interesting question. For me, I'm 37 years old. The only real impact with Bobby Kennedy I've had, and no joke, is actually driving over the Robert Kennedy Bridge to get to Shea Stadium. So he has been that far removed from my lexicon, because of the passage of time. And the answer to your question is I really don't know, because since he was cut down, he didn't live, he didn't really have that opportunity to influence, I can't really say. And what's very interesting is to see how the change of political figures from the 1980s and the 1990s has gone as time has worn on. Ideas that they embraced later in their life, things that they did. So I can't say that, but I can say that it would be very interesting to see what would have happened had he lived, whether he got the nomination or not, what path the Democrat Party would have gone, and the Kennedy family as a whole.
I think in response to what you said about our fractured nation, I think that Bobby Kennedy was what the country needed then, because when Martin Luther King was shot, I think most of us probably hear about and have heard about his speech in Indiana, where hell could have broken loose. Right. And he announced it and kept them calm with his words and his mannerisms, and they averted marches and riots.
Susan, I think you're ignoring some of the political realities of the fact. The fact is, the Democratic South was in.
I'm talking about Indiana.
I'm talking about the Democratic South was in turmoil. You had a third-party candidate in George Wallace who had run for election.
Oh, I know that.
And who was splitting your party asunder.
I know,
but interestingly, Kennedy was pulling in some of that Wallace support. He was unifying across the board after Martin Luther King's death. His words did have an effect.
Well,
and that's
why
I come back to
the
unifying message that might have helped.
McCarthy was still in the race, and Humphrey still had the party.
Humphrey won it.
Humphrey had the party regulars behind them. Right. So the regulars of the Democratic Party at that time was not all decided by primary vote.
And the primaries had essentially
but regulars
ended
can
with
be
California.
moved by oratory, by extermal events that force a change in their
Mannerisms.
opinions. They can be won
And
over.
one of the
Believe me,
things-
they can be
one
won
of
over.
We have to.
The one
Unfortunately,
thing,
we have to
though,
wrap
about
this.
what
We have to
he
wrap
said,
this
though,
up,
and I
Susan.
said this to you, is
Thank
he
you.
said the same
You're
thing
being
to
cut off.
everybody. Right. And that would have gotten through, I think, had he stayed around.
Oh, I'm glad you made your point.
Thank you.
The point that I was going to make is it was a tragedy that Robert Kennedy was shot, and we lost a great leader for our nation. Stay tuned for Parting Shots. And welcome back. In a world torn asunder, D-Day was not the only battle being waged on June 6, 1944. In the Pacific Theater, Marines were preparing for another bloody assault on a tiny Pacific island, this time the island of Saipan. In Italy, the Allies were making their first attack on the city of Rome, having fought their way through North Africa, Sicily, and up the Italian coast. But the landings in Normandy have such symbolism and special meaning for us all in the fight for liberty. That same spirit still exists today in America, and we cannot allow ourselves to forget the message of Bobby Kennedy that we should appeal to our better selves and reconcile with one another should we forget the sacrifices that were paid on D-Day to make America great and to make America the greatest nation on earth. Now with Parting Shots, Rich Parsons.
Well, thanks, Casey. And my parting shot, I want to talk about two things that really do and should bring us together as a community, as a city, and as a nation. First is the Washington Capitals winning the Stanley Cup, their first one ever in franchise history. What a moment for Alex Ovechkin, Nick Backstrom, the entire team, and the fans who celebrated peacefully without any incidents. The whole city, thousands of people pouring out in the street. It was a great moment for this capital, for this nation, for this region. One of the rare things that brings us all together. The other thing that really brings us together is the right to vote and the duty to participate in our election process. And this week, coming up is the beginning of early voting here in Maryland. I want to encourage everybody to get out and do your civic duty, get out and vote, either early voting or on June 26th in the primary elections. And that's how we celebrate our American citizenship and the rights of this country that people fought and died for at D-Day and elsewhere.
Thank you, Rich. Mark Uncapher, your parting shot.
Well, let me concur with both of Rich's points. I think you're right on the money on that. This week, the Washington Post took another swipe at Mark Ulrich. This was a reference to his comment that jobs should be located to Frederick County, which the Post took great exception to. I'm almost looking forward to, if Mark Ulrich does win the primary, the Washington Post editorial page having to decide between Mark Ulrich on the left and Robin Ficker on the right. We'll see how they come out on that one.
That'll be an interesting juxtaposition, won't it, Mark?
A lot of Democrats, too.
Phil Bell, your parting shot.
Well, this morning, as everybody was kind of recovering from the enjoyment of the Capitals' win, we got terrible news that Charles Krauthammer, one of the strongest voices on the right for generations now, is just about at the end of his life. Now, in recent years, maybe some of his stances have been a little bit controversial, but he has been a tremendous voice, and he will be truly missed.
Thank you, Phil. Susan Heltemes, your parting shot.
In response to what you said, Casey, last weekend I was in Minnesota burying my uncle, who was a World War II veteran, and the priest said they just don't make them like that anymore. But in light of the fact that Anthony Bourdain just committed suicide, and a few days ago Kate Spade committed suicide, I heard this morning a report on NPR that people who are lonely and have issues and relate to one of these people are likely to commit, or could very well commit suicide themselves. So there is a program in the county called the letter B, the1.org. So if you know of someone who needs help, call that. And the National Suicide Prevention Hotline is 800-273-8255. That's 800-273-8255. It's among us, and we need to be the one. And keep track of our family and friends and see what we can do to prevent it.
Thank you, Susan. Having had a dear friend commit suicide a few years ago, it's one of those things that impacts your life and really is devastating for all. I want to thank the panel for being here tonight. A very spirited debate. Now, next week, Mark Uncapher is going to be subbing for me as I travel out to California to attend a friend's son's wedding in near San Francisco. And the following week, Susan Heltemes is going to be doing the hosting duties. And I can't wait to see the tapes of those two shows to see the contrast in the production of the show.
I'll be on your show.
I just wish I had a little bird in here telling me what was going on. But I want to thank everyone for being here. We have 2 weeks before the election. It's going to be an exciting election and an exciting summer. For 21 this week, I'm Casey Aiken. And remember to continue to watch Montgomery County's hardest hitting political talk show.